The light was barely distinguishable from darkness when Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner rubbed his bleary eyes on the morning of June 6, 1944. Standing on the observation platform of Luftwaffe Airfield St-Lô, 30 kilometers inland from the Normandy coast, he stared in disbelief at what looked like a moving constellation spreading across the pre-dawn horizon. The young fighter pilot blinked, certain his exhaustion was causing hallucinations. But the distant droning sound confirmed the impossible reality materializing before him. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of aircraft silhouettes crawling across the sky like a mechanical plague of locusts. What Brenner witnessed that morning defied 6 years of indoctrination about Allied manufacturing weakness and German air superiority. The sky wasn't filled with dozens of transport planes as Luftwaffe intelligence had warned might appear. Instead, a seemingly endless armada of C-47 Dakotas and other transports stretched from horizon to horizon, disgorging thousands of paratroopers over Normandy in the largest airborne operation in military history. Unmöglich, Brenner whispered, the coffee cup slipping from his hand and shattering on the concrete. Impossible. But the impossible was happening before his eyes, and within minutes the realization would spread through the German defenses like wildfire. This was not a feint or diversionary attack. This was the beginning of the Allied invasion, delivered by an aerial fleet that Nazi propaganda had insisted could not exist. For years, the Nazi leadership had carefully cultivated the myth of Luftwaffe dominance and Allied industrial inferiority. Goebbels's propaganda machine had consistently downplayed American manufacturing capabilities, dismissing reports of Roosevelt's ambitious production goals as Jewish capitalist fantasies. German pilots and soldiers were told repeatedly that the decadent Americans could never match the disciplined efficiency of German industry. The Führer himself had declared in 1942 that the United States was a nation of showmen, incapable of sustained war production. This carefully constructed narrative shaped the worldview of the entire Wehrmacht, from high command to frontline soldiers, creating a dangerous disconnect between expectation and reality. The psychological impact of witnessing the true scale of Allied air power that morning was often as devastating as the military consequences. For men like Brenner, whose entire understanding of the strategic balance had been built on Nazi propaganda, the sight of hundreds of C-47s filling the sky forced a complete re-evaluation of Germany's chances in the war. What Brenner saw defied 18 years of Nazi indoctrination and 6 years of wartime propaganda. In that moment, he understood that the Reich had been lying, not just about this operation, but about the fundamental balance of power in the war. As the sky gradually brightened from black to deep purple, the full scale of the airborne invasion became clearer. Across Normandy, from Sainte-Mère-Église to Ouistreham, German observers reported the same astonishing sight. Many initially believed they were witnessing a massive bombing raid, only to realize with growing horror that each aircraft was disgorging sticks of paratroopers. The sheer number of aircraft overhead rendered the vaunted Luftwaffe not merely outnumbered, but effectively irrelevant on this most critical of battlefields. To understand the psychological shock of Operation Overlord on Luftwaffe personnel, we must first examine the dramatic disparity between what German pilots had been told about Allied production capabilities and the overwhelming reality they faced in June 1944. During the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had indeed enjoyed significant advantages in experience, tactics, and often equipment. The stunning successes of Blitzkrieg from 1939 to 1941 had seemed to confirm the Nazi narrative of German technological and military superiority. Even as late as 1943, with Allied bombing campaigns intensifying, many in the Luftwaffe genuinely believed they were facing an enemy with limited industrial capacity who could be defeated through superior German engineering and willpower. This belief was deliberately reinforced by Nazi leadership. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a sophisticated campaign to convince both German military personnel and civilians that America's industrial might was greatly exaggerated. In his diaries recovered after the war, Goebbels noted that maintaining the fiction of German technological superiority was essential to military morale. Speeches by Hitler and Goering consistently portrayed the United States as a nation of department store owners and film producers incapable of matching German military production. German intelligence services did have access to more realistic assessments of American industrial capacity, particularly after President Roosevelt's famous announcement in January 1942 that America would produce 50,000 aircraft that year. However, these reports were often dismissed as enemy propaganda or deliberately suppressed before reaching frontline units. A captured intelligence briefing from April 1944 showed that Luftwaffe pilots were told to expect no more than 500 Allied transport aircraft for any invasion attempt, with most likely to be vulnerable British models rather than the more capable American C-47 Dakotas. The reality could not have been more different. By 1944, American factories were producing aircraft at a rate that would have seemed fantastical in 1939. Douglas Aircraft Company's production lines for the C-47 were turning out approximately 5 aircraft per day, with a total of more than 10,000 C-47s produced during the war. A single American factory often produced more aircraft in a month than the entire Luftwaffe received as replacements during the same period. This staggering output represented not just a quantitative advantage, but a fundamental qualitative shift in the nature of modern warfare, the industrialization of air power on a scale never before seen. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, a Luftwaffe night fighter ace with 58 victories, later described the psychological impact of confronting this reality. We had been told repeatedly that American production figures were propaganda. Even those of us who suspected the truth did not grasp the full scale until we saw the invasion armada. It was like being told a man is tall, and then meeting a giant. Jabs was one of the few Luftwaffe pilots who managed to scramble aircraft during the early hours of the invasion, but his squadron of just 6 Messerschmitt Bf-1 10-night fighters could do little more than observe the vast air fleet passing overhead. The German air defense system in Normandy had been designed to counter what Luftwaffe planners believed was possible: periodic raids by dozens or perhaps 100 aircraft. On the morning of June 6th, they faced over 1,000 C-47s, carrying more than 13,000 paratroopers, protected by fighters and preceded by pathfinders. The German radar stations, already compromised by Allied jamming and deception measures, were simply overwhelmed by the scale of the operation. Many operators initially believed their equipment was malfunctioning when it showed hundreds of aircraft approaching simultaneously. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Meyer, a radar operator stationed near Caen, recorded in his diary, "The screen showed so many aircraft that I reported it as equipment failure. My commanding officer accused me of drunkenness. 20 minutes later, we could hear the armada approaching, and by then it was too late for an effective response." Meyer's experience was typical across Normandy. German defensive preparations proved inadequate, not because they were poorly designed, but because they had been scaled for a fundamentally different type of threat than what actually materialized. For the Allied planners of Operation Overlord, the massive airborne drop was a calculated risk. Historical experience, particularly the German airborne invasion of Crete in 1941, had demonstrated both the potential and the vulnerability of paratroopers. The Germans had captured Crete, but suffered such severe casualties that Hitler never again authorized a major airborne operation. Allied commanders, particularly American generals like Matthew Ridgway and Maxwell Taylor, believed that the sheer scale of their planned operation would overcome the inherent vulnerabilities of airborne forces by overwhelming German defenses through mass and surprise. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, That theory was put to the ultimate test. The vast air fleet assembled in England included not just the transport aircraft, but an elaborate support structure, pathfinders to mark drop zones, electronic countermeasures to confuse German radar, and fighter escorts to suppress any Luftwaffe response. More than 1,300 transport aircraft would deliver approximately 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, plus several thousand British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division. This was no small raiding force, but a full-scale aerial invasion intended to secure key objectives behind the Atlantic Wall and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. The scale was necessary not just for military reasons, but for psychological impact as well. Allied planners understood that the sight of thousands of paratroopers descending simultaneously would have a profoundly demoralizing effect on German defenders, creating confusion and panic that would compound the practical military advantages. For Oberleutnant Brenner and other Luftwaffe personnel witnessing the invasion, the most shocking aspect was not just the number of aircraft, but the casual display of industrial might they represented. Each C-47 Dakota cost approximately $100,000 to produce, a significant sum in 1944. The Americans were deploying these valuable aircraft by the hundreds, risking their loss to flak and fighters to deliver paratroopers more efficiently than could be achieved by land. This cavalier use of expensive equipment revealed an abundance mindset that was completely foreign to the scarcity-conditioned German military of 1944. It was as if they were throwing gold coins at us, Hauptmann Gerhard Müller of Jagdgeschwader 2 later recalled. We had been carefully husbanding every aircraft, counting each replacement as a precious resource, while the Americans were darkening the sky with transports as if they cost nothing. This perception was not entirely accurate. Allied planners had carefully calculated the risks and benefits, but it reflected the genuine psychological impact of witnessing such material abundance after years of increasing German austerity. The realities of 1944 were a far cry from the Luftwaffe's glory days. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a severely diminished force, especially in Western Europe. Fuel shortages had drastically reduced training hours for new pilots, while the demands of the Eastern Front and the defense of the Reich against strategic bombing had drawn away many experienced air crews. In the Normandy region specifically, Luftwaffe strength had been reduced to fewer than 300 operational aircraft, many of them obsolescent models flown by inexperienced pilots. In contrast, the Allied air forces had assembled more than 11,000 aircraft for Operation Overlord, including 5,000 fighters. This overwhelming numerical superiority was the result of deliberate Allied strategy. 4 months before D-Day, the Allied air forces had conducted a systematic campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe, both through direct air battles and by targeting aircraft production facilities. By June 1944, they had achieved near-total air superiority over northern France, a prerequisite for the massive airborne operation that began the invasion. Major Friedrich Wilhelm Müller commanded a Luftwaffe flak battalion near Carentan, directly in the path of the American airborne landings. His unit's experience illustrates the overwhelming nature of the Allied air assault. We had been told to expect perhaps 100 transport aircraft, against which our 88mm guns would be effective. Instead, we faced wave after wave, many flying too high for accurate targeting. We expended our daily ammunition allowance in 30 minutes, and still they kept coming. For the first time, I understood what it meant to face an enemy with limitless resources. Major Müller's observation highlights a critical aspect of the psychological impact. The impression of limitless resources fundamentally contradicted the German experience of the war by 1944. While German forces faced increasingly severe shortages of everything from fuel to ammunition, the Allies appeared to have inexhaustible supplies. This disparity created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult for many German personnel to process, challenging their basic understanding of the strategic situation and their prospects for victory. The impact of the airborne operation extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For many German personnel, it represented their first direct contact with the full weight of American industrial power, no longer an abstract threat, but a tangible, overwhelming presence directly overhead. Feldwebel Ernst Juncker, an anti-aircraft gunner positioned near Sainte-Mère-Église, wrote in a letter discovered after the war, "The sky was filled with aircraft for nearly 3 hours. We fired until our barrels overheated, but it made no difference. For every plane that fell, 20 more appeared. I understood then that all the speeches about final victory were lies." This realization was particularly damaging to morale because it undermined one of the central narratives of Nazi propaganda, the inherent superiority of German organization, technology, and will. The sight of hundreds of C-47s operating in coordinated fashion, delivering thousands of paratroopers with precision despite adverse conditions, demonstrated that the Americans had mastered the very qualities of technical competence and organizational efficiency that German propaganda had claimed as uniquely German virtues. The abundance displayed during the airborne operation also forced many German personnel to confront an uncomfortable truth about the fundamental nature of the war. Since 1941, Nazi leadership had characterized the conflict as a struggle between German spiritual values and American materialism. In this framing, the supposed German advantages of discipline, willpower, and racial cohesion would ultimately triumph over mere material superiority. The sight of the Allied air armada starkly revealed the hollowness of this narrative. In modern industrial warfare, material superiority translated directly into military power in ways that no amount of willpower could overcome. Lieutenant Walter Schaefer, a Luftwaffe communications officer stationed near Caen, later told Allied interrogators, "When I saw the invasion fleet both in the air and at sea, I realized we had been living in a fantasy world. Our leaders had spoken of secret weapons and special advantages, but the reality was that we were facing an enemy who could produce more in a month than we could in a year. No amount of bravery or tactical skill could overcome such a disparity." To fully understand the impact of witnessing the C-47 Armada, we must consider the broader context of the German war experience by June 1944. For the previous 3 years, the German military and civilian population had been subjected to ever-increasing hardship. Rationing had become progressively more severe, military equipment was increasingly scarce and of declining quality, and the strategic situation had deteriorated on all fronts. Despite these realities, Nazi propaganda continued to promise eventual victory through revolutionary new weapons, superior German fighting spirit, and the inevitable collapse of the unnatural alliance between Western capitalism and Soviet communism. This narrative required increasing levels of cognitive dissonance to maintain, creating a fragile psychological state that was vulnerable to direct contradictory evidence. For many German personnel, the sight of the C-47 Armada provided exactly such evidence, undeniable, overwhelming proof that the strategic situation was fundamentally different from what they had been led to believe. The psychological impact was often profound, with reactions ranging from shock and demoralization to anger at having been deceived by their own leadership. Feldwebel Hans Schmidt, serving in a Luftwaffe communications unit near Carentan, recorded in his diary, "The first light revealed so many parachutes that they looked like snowflakes. Our lieutenant stood watching without speaking, then finally said, 'If they can spare this many men and planes for just the first wave, we have been lied to about everything.' He walked to his quarters and shot himself an hour later." While such extreme reactions were not common, the sense of betrayal expressed by Schmidt's lieutenant was widespread, particularly among ideologically committed personnel who had genuinely believed in ultimate German victory. For others, the revelation came not as a shock, but as confirmation of doubts they had harbored but suppressed. Hauptmann Karl Weizsäcker, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer captured on June 7th, told his American interrogators, "Many of us had suspected for months that the situation was worse than officially admitted, but to see the actual scale of your air power was still staggering." It answered the question that many officers had been asking privately, not whether Germany would lose, but how quickly. The impact was particularly acute for Luftwaffe personnel, whose professional identity was built around German air power. To witness total Allied air dominance, with the once mighty Luftwaffe reduced to a token presence, represented not just a military defeat, but a professional humiliation. Fighter pilots who had joined the Luftwaffe during its glory days now found themselves largely grounded by fuel shortages, outnumbered when they did fly, and increasingly outclassed by newer Allied aircraft types. For these men, the massive C-47 formation, flying relatively slowly and presenting ideal targets under normal circumstances, represented a particular form of psychological torture, displaying enemy transports they could see, but could not effectively attack. Major Anton Reichert commanded a depleted Luftwaffe fighter squadron at Karpike Airfield, near Caen. On the morning of June 6th, he had only 4 operational Focke-Wulf 190 fighter aircraft and pilots to fly them. His after-action report, captured when the airfield was overrun 3 weeks later, provides a telling glimpse of the Luftwaffe's impotence during the invasion. Received orders at 04:15 hours to intercept enemy transports reported approaching coast. Scrambled all available aircraft by 04:45. Encountered enemy formation of approximately 200 transports protected by estimated 50 fighters. Attempted to attack, but were immediately engaged by Spitfires and forced to withdraw. Lost 2 aircraft and 1 pilot. No enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged. Mission failed completely. Reichert's experience was typical. The few Luftwaffe fighters that managed to take off on June 6th were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers of Allied fighters specifically tasked with protecting the vulnerable transports. The Allies had correctly identified air superiority as the essential prerequisite for the airborne operation and had allocated resources accordingly. This represented another aspect of industrial superiority, the ability to assign specialized aircraft to specialized roles rather than relying on limited numbers of multi-purpose platforms as the resource-constrained Luftwaffe was increasingly forced to do. The production numbers behind the airborne invasion tell their own story about the disparity in industrial capacity. By 1944, American factories were producing approximately 8,000 aircraft per month, compared to a German maximum of around 3,000. More specifically, Douglas Aircraft was producing C-47s at a rate that the Germans could barely comprehend. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced over 10,000 C-47s, while German production of the roughly comparable Junkers Ju-52 transport never exceeded 350 aircraft per year, and by 1944 had fallen substantially due to resource constraints and bombing. This production disparity extended to every category of equipment visible during the invasion. Each American paratrooper was equipped with specialized gear that represented significant industrial investment, from the parachutes themselves, each requiring hundreds of square feet of nylon, a material in critically short supply in Germany, to purpose-designed weapons like the folding-stock M1A1 carbine, to the personal equipment that allowed soldiers to function independently after landing. German observers noted with particular bitterness that captured American paratroopers often carried chocolate bars, cigarettes, and other small luxuries that had become rare even for German officers. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller, a German paratroop veteran who had participated in the invasion of Crete and now faced American paratroopers in Normandy, wrote in his personal journal, "Their equipment makes ours look like it was made for children. Each man carries more ammunition than our entire squad is allocated in a week. Their rations are better than what our officers receive. Even their uniforms are of better quality material. How can we fight an enemy who equips their ordinary soldiers better than we equip our elite forces? This question, how to fight an enemy with such overwhelming material advantages, increasingly preoccupied German commanders at all levels. Traditional German military doctrine had emphasized maneuver, initiative, and tactical skill as compensating factors for material disadvantages, an approach that had proven successful during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. By 1944, however, the material disparity had grown so extreme that tactical advantages could no longer bridge the gap, a reality that the airborne operation demonstrated with painful clarity. General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations at OKW, German High Command, later wrote, "The Allied airborne landings on D-Day represented a threshold moment. Before that day, many in the High Command still believed that superior German tactical doctrine could overcome Allied material advantages. After witnessing the scale and precision of the airborne operation, it became impossible to maintain this illusion. The war of production had been decisively lost." This realization led to varying responses among German personnel. Some, particularly those with strong ideological commitment to Nazism, doubled down on fanatical resistance, clinging to hopes of miracle weapons or political division among the Allies. Others began a psychological process of detachment, continuing to fight but with diminishing conviction and increasing focus on personal survival. A significant number, especially among more educated officers, began actively considering how to position themselves for the post-war period, recognizing that German defeat was now inevitable. The airborne operation's psychological impact extended beyond military personnel to the French civilian population and German civilian administrators in the occupied territories. For 4 years, Nazi propaganda had presented the German occupation as permanent and unassailable, with the Wehrmacht described as the most powerful military force in history. The sight of thousands of Allied paratroopers descending from the sky, followed by news of the beach landings, shattered this narrative overnight. Robert Leblanc, a French civilian living near Sainte-Mère-Église, recalled, "We had heard BBC broadcasts about the coming liberation, but many had started to believe it would never happen. When I saw the sky filled with parachutes, I witnessed something remarkable. The German soldiers, who had strutted around our village for 4 years acting invincible, suddenly looked terrified. Their faces showed what we had waited so long to see, the knowledge that their time was ending." For the German occupation authorities, the psychological shock was particularly acute because the airborne operation directly contradicted their most fundamental assumptions about Allied capabilities and intentions. Many had convinced themselves that a cross-channel invasion was impossible, or that any attempt would be easily repulsed. The sight of Allied paratroopers landing in large numbers, coupled with reports of the beach landings, forced a rapid reassessment that many were psychologically unprepared to make. Dr. Klaus Schoenfeld, a German civilian administrator in Caen, wrote in his diary on June 6, "This morning's events have rendered 4 years of our work here meaningless. The military assures us they will drive the invaders back into the sea, but the scale of the attack suggests otherwise. I have ordered the destruction of administrative records and begun preparations for evacuation, despite official directives to maintain normal operations. What I saw in the sky this morning cannot be stopped by optimistic telegrams from Berlin." The contrast between Allied aerial abundance and German scarcity was particularly stark in the specific context of paratroop operations. Prior to D-Day, the largest German airborne operation had been the invasion of Crete in May 1941, which involved approximately 15,000 paratroopers and glider-borne infantry. While initially successful, the operation had cost the Germans so heavily, with nearly 4,000 casualties, including many of their best paratroopers, that Hitler had forbidden further large-scale airborne operations. By 1944, the German Fallschirmjäger, paratroop forces, were still considered elite infantry, but they operated almost exclusively as ground forces due to the lack of transport aircraft and the general deterioration of the Luftwaffe. The few transport aircraft that remained that were critically needed for resupply operations, particularly on the Eastern Front, and could not be risked in vulnerable paratroop deployment roles. This operational constraint was well known to Luftwaffe officers, making the sight of hundreds of American C-47s committed to the paratroop role particularly demoralizing. A vivid demonstration that the Allies could routinely accomplish what had become impossible for Germany. Oberst Max Pemsel, a former commander of German paratroops now serving as a staff officer in Normandy, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The American airborne operation on D-Day exceeded in scale anything we had ever attempted, even at the height of our power. To see it executed by an enemy we had been told was on the verge of collapse was the final disillusionment. I knew then that the war was lost, regardless of what happened on the beaches." The scale of the Allied airborne operation also revealed the extent to which German intelligence had failed. Despite extensive reconnaissance and espionage networks in Britain, German intelligence had fundamentally misjudged both the timing and the scale of the invasion. More critically, they had failed to accurately assess Allied production capabilities and logistics systems, leaving German forces in Normandy unprepared for the actual threat they faced. This intelligence failure had multiple causes, including Allied deception operations and the increasing effectiveness of counterintelligence measures. However, it also reflected a more fundamental problem within the German military and political leadership, the tendency to filter and interpret information through the lens of ideology rather than objective analysis. Reports that contradicted the official narrative of German superiority were frequently dismissed or suppressed, creating a dangerously distorted picture of reality that collapsed when confronted with the actual Allied capabilities displayed on D-Day. General Major Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, intelligence officer for Army Group B, later testified, "Our assessment of Allied air transport capacity was wrong by an order of magnitude. We estimated they could deploy perhaps 300 transport aircraft for the invasion. When reports came in of over 1,000, they were initially disbelieved. This was not merely a tactical surprise, but a fundamental failure to understand the enemy we were facing. Beyond the immediate military implications, the sight of hundreds of C-47s filling the sky forced many German personnel to confront the underlying reality of the war, that it had become a contest of industrial production that Germany could not win. The United States, protected by oceanic barriers and untouched by bombing until very late in the war, and then only marginally by Japanese balloon bombs, had transformed its enormous industrial base entirely to war production. By 1944, this transformation was complete, with American factories producing military equipment in quantities that European observers found difficult to comprehend. The critical insight that dawned on many German observers on June 6 was not just that they were outnumbered in the current battle, but that the disparity would only increase over time. Each C-47 lost could be replaced by American factories within days, while German losses were increasingly permanent. This created a fundamental strategic asymmetry that no tactical brilliance could overcome, a reality that many German officers had suspected but could now see directly demonstrated in the sky above Normandy. Oberleutnant Peter Heissig, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer captured near Caen on June 8, told his interrogators, "The sight of your transport aircraft was more demoralizing than your fighters or bombers because it demonstrated your strategic depth. We knew you could replace losses indefinitely, while we could not. This is not a matter of courage or skill, but simple mathematics, and the mathematics of this war have become impossible for Germany." The C-47 Dakota itself became a powerful symbol of this disparity. Originally developed as the civilian DC-3 airliner in the 1930s, the C-47 military variant represented the successful conversion of civilian industrial capacity to military purposes, precisely the transformation that German war planners had failed to fully achieve. The German equivalent, the Junkers Ju-52, was an older design produced in far smaller numbers, with production constantly disrupted by bombing and resource shortages. More fundamentally, the C-47 embodied the American approach to warfare, emphasizing standardization, reliability, and mass production over craft manufacturing or theoretical perfection. Each aircraft was designed to be produced quickly, operated by pilots with minimal specialized training, maintained under field conditions with interchangeable parts, and capable of performing its core functions with maximum efficiency. This industrial philosophy stood in marked contrast to German equipment designs, which often prioritized engineering excellence and theoretical performance over practicality or ease of production. Major Heinrich Kreipe, a Luftwaffe officer who had toured American aircraft factories in 1938 as part of a German military delegation, recalled his observations after witnessing the D-Day air fleet. What impressed me in the American factories was not any technical superiority. Indeed, some of their methods seemed crude compared to ours, but the single-minded focus on volume and speed. They designed aircraft to be built by workers with minimal training, using standardized parts and assembly line methods we considered beneath German engineering standards. I thought this would produce inferior aircraft, but seeing the endless formation of C-47s over Normandy, I understood their wisdom. Quantity has a quality all its own. This observation highlights another psychological dimension of the airborne operations impact. It forced a reevaluation of basic assumptions about quality versus quantity in modern warfare. German military tradition had always emphasized qualitative superiority, from the era of Frederick the Great through the World Wars. By 1944, this emphasis had evolved into a near-religious belief that German quality, in equipment, training, or racial characteristics depending on the context, could overcome Allied quantity. The sight of hundreds of C-47s, aircraft that were not technically superior to German designs but were available in overwhelming numbers, directly challenged this belief system. It suggested that in modern industrial warfare, a good enough solution produced in volume was more effective than an excellent solution produced in limited quantities. This was a difficult concept for many German officers to accept, as it contradicted not just their military training but their cultural values and self-image. General Lieutenant Max Pamsel, who survived the war and later wrote extensively about the psychological impact of Allied material superiority, observed, "The American approach to war production violated everything we had been taught about German craftsmanship and excellence. Their aircraft were designed for mass production rather than optimal performance. Their vehicles emphasized standardization over specialization. Even their tactical doctrine accepted higher casualties in exchange for speed and simplicity. We considered this approach crude and wasteful, but it proved devastatingly effective. They simply overwhelmed us with acceptable solutions while we strove for perfect ones that arrived too late and in too few numbers." This realization had profound implications beyond the immediate military situation. It suggested that Germany's entire approach to industrial organization and economic management was fundamentally flawed in the context of total war, a conclusion with disturbing implications for German cultural identity, which had long been built around concepts of precision, craftsmanship, and technical excellence. To accept that the American system of mass production was more effective in wartime meant questioning values that many Germans considered central to their national character. Oberstleutnant Werner Kreipe, no relation to Heinrich, a Luftwaffe staff officer who would later rise to become acting chief of the General Staff, wrote in his diary on June 10th, "The lesson of Normandy is that we have been defeated not just militarily but industrially and organizationally. The Americans have demonstrated that their system of production, which we have always dismissed as creating quantity without quality, is superior for the purposes of modern war. This is a bitter realization that many will resist, but it cannot be ignored by those who have seen the results with their own eyes. For the German personnel witnessing the airborne operation, there was also a sense of historical irony that added to the psychological impact. Many remembered that it was Germany that had pioneered airborne warfare, with spectacular successes in the Netherlands in 1940 and Crete in 1941. To now see their own innovation turned against them with far greater resources was particularly demoralizing, suggesting that Germany had lost not just material superiority, but even its former advantage in tactical innovation. Hauptmann Ernst Jünger, a highly decorated veteran of both world wars and notable German author, wrote in his diary after visiting Normandy in late June, "The Americans have not merely copied our airborne tactics, but industrialized them, transforming what was for us a specialized operation, requiring our best troops into a mass-produced capability, available in seemingly unlimited quantities. This represents a fundamental transformation in the character of war that we failed to anticipate, the full integration of industrial mass production with military operations. This observation points to a deeper truth about the Allied victory. It represented not just greater resources, but a more effective integration of industrial capacity with military operations. The United States, in particular, had successfully merged the skills and values of its industrial sector with its military planning, creating a war machine that maximized the impact of America's productive advantages. This integration was visible in everything from equipment standardization to logistics systems to tactical doctrine, all designed to leverage industrial strength rather than attempting to overcome material limitations through tactical brilliance. For German personnel trained in a military tradition that emphasized the primacy of operational art and tactical skill, this American approach initially appeared crude and unimaginative. By June 1944, however, its effectiveness had become undeniable. The sight of hundreds of C-47s operating in coordinated formation, delivering thousands of paratroopers with methodical precision, provided a visible demonstration of what American General George Patton would later call the American way of war, the application of overwhelming material superiority through straightforward but meticulously planned operations. Oberstleutnant Helmut Rittgen, a Luftwaffe officer who survived the war and later wrote a comparative analysis of German and American military-industrial organization, concluded, "The ultimate American advantage was not merely production capacity, but the effective integration of industrial and military thinking. Their officers understood factories and logistics as thoroughly as tactics, while their industrialists understood military requirements. This integration, more than any single weapon or tactic, was what we witnessed in the skies over Normandy, and what we could not match regardless of individual bravery or operational skill. For the individual German soldiers facing the paratroopers after they landed, the material disparity became even more apparent. American paratroopers carried not only better personal equipment, but more abundant ammunition, superior rations, and more effective communications gear. Even after the confusion of the drop, which scattered units across the countryside, American paratroopers typically had sufficient supplies to operate independently for several days, a capability that German forces, increasingly constrained by logistics limitations, could no longer match. Feldwebel Heinrich Meyer, who faced elements of the 101st Airborne near Carentan, recorded his observations in a letter found in his effects after he was killed on June 8th. "The Americans carry more ammunition for each weapon than our entire squad receives in a week. When we captured one of their supply bundles, we found chocolate, cigarettes, and canned meat of a quality our officers haven't seen in a year. Their radios are smaller than ours, but have greater range. Even their medical supplies are more abundant and effective than what our field hospitals receive. How can we defeat an enemy who equips their ordinary soldiers better than we supply our best units?" This direct experience of American material abundance had a powerful effect on German morale. particularly among the more experienced soldiers who could make direct comparisons to their own deteriorating situation. Many had endured years of gradually worsening conditions, with equipment becoming scarcer and of lower quality, rations reduced, and replacements arriving with inadequate training. To face an enemy experiencing the opposite trajectory, with increasingly abundant and improved equipment, created a sense of futility that corroded combat motivation. The airborne landings of D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, though nearly a year of bitter fighting remained. For many German personnel who witnessed the operation, however, that morning provided a moment of clarity about the inevitable outcome of the war. The sight of hundreds of C-47s filling the sky with paratroopers represented more than just a tactical surprise or operational setback. It was a visceral demonstration of the fundamental strategic reality that Nazi leadership had attempted to obscure. Germany was facing enemies whose combined industrial might it could never hope to match. Major Anton Reichert, the Luftwaffe squadron commander who had attempted to intercept the transport formation, summarized this realization in his final report before being killed in action on June 20th. What we witnessed on the morning of June 6th was not merely an invasion, but a demonstration of industrial power that no amount of courage or tactical skill can overcome. The hundreds of transport aircraft filling the sky represented factories, resources, and logistic systems beyond anything we can match. In that moment, I understood with complete clarity that regardless of what happens in the current battle, Germany has lost the war. This understanding spread through the German forces in the weeks following D-Day, contributing to a gradual but unmistakable decline in resistance as the reality of the strategic situation became impossible to ignore. While fanatical elements continued to fight with undiminished intensity, a growing number of German personnel began to focus on personal survival rather than victory, a shift in motivation that accelerated as Allied material superiority became increasingly evident in all aspects of the campaign. The massive airborne operation that began D-Day thus achieved not just its immediate military objectives, but a profound psychological impact that helped undermine German resistance. By directly challenging core narratives of Nazi propaganda about Allied capabilities and German technological superiority, it accelerated the collapse of morale that would ultimately contribute to Germany's defeat. For the Luftwaffe personnel who watched helplessly as hundreds of C-47s filled the dawn sky with paratroopers, it provided an unforgettable demonstration that the war of production had been decisively lost, regardless of what happened on the battlefield below. In the decades following the war, many former Luftwaffe personnel would cite that morning as their moment of clarity, when the carefully constructed fictions of Nazi propaganda collapsed in the face of overwhelming evidence. Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner, who survived the war and later became a commercial pilot for Lufthansa, reflected in a 1975 interview, "We had been told repeatedly that American production figures were propaganda, that their aircraft were inferior, that their industry was crippled by strikes and inefficiency." Then came that morning in June when the sky filled with aircraft, more than I had believed existed in the entire Allied inventory. In that moment, all the lies were exposed at once, and the truth was undeniable. We were not losing the war, we had already lost it. The legacy of that realization continues to influence military thinking to the present day. Modern military doctrine in all advanced nations now explicitly recognizes the critical importance of industrial capacity and logistic systems alongside tactical proficiency and technological advancement. The lesson learned at such cost in the skies over Normandy that industrial might effectively harnessed to military purpose represents a decisive advantage in modern warfare, remains as valid today as it was on the morning of June 6, 1944, when Luftwaffe pilots watched in disbelief as C-47 Dakotas filled the sky with paratroopers before dawn.